So, without any more ado, I would have great privilege to introduce our first speaker, who is Olivier De Schutter, who many of you will know, if not directly by reputation. You'll be aware that he has now come almost to the end of his second term as United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food, and we are extremely grateful to him for all the work that he has done to push forward understanding across many countries of what the challenges are in realising the right to food. And picking up on a number of, he'll tell us I'm sure, but picking on a number of key issues, be it agroecology or seeds or fisheries or whatever, picking up these key issues and trying to analyse them and see how policy could change in order to better realise the right to food and to sustain food provision in the future. So, given his manically hectic agenda, we are deeply grateful to you, sir, for coming and joining us in your last few months as Special Rapporteur, and I hope that's not the last we see of you, to present us with some reflections on what you've learned over the past several years, and to give us some guidance, I think, about how best we can interact with decision makers in order to get them to understand what the majorities say and what the majority need. Olivier, thank you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, first of all, to Patrick Mulvaney and UK Food Group for their invitation to summarize in 20 minutes what I've been doing over the past 5 years and a half. Let me summarize this really by trying to remember where we come from and where the food systems we inherit from come from. These systems have really grown to be shaped as they are in the 1950s and 60s based on one major preoccupation. And that preoccupation was to boost production in order to satisfy growing demand in a context in which demographic growth was very strong and in which the productivity of agriculture was relatively low and not making progress swiftly enough. In 1965, we had actually reached a peak in terms of demographic growth. At the time, the population in the world was increasing by 2.5% each year, which is almost double what it is now, since we now have a population growth of 1.4%. At the time, we had large regions that were underperforming in terms of agricultural yields, and the productivity of agriculture was insufficiently fast in making progress to cope with this increasing demand. And so, in the West, in the global South, the preoccupation was in the 50s and 60s to boost production and to reward economies of scale, to reward bigness, to reward efficiency above everything else. Judged by its own terms, this has been a very successful story. Over the past 50 years, agricultural productivity increased 2.1% every year. And very soon, we managed to increase agricultural productivity much faster than population itself, since the rate of population growth was declining at the same time. But 50 years later, after the Common Agricultural Policy was launched in the early 1960s, after in the US a big push was made to support the production of large-scale cereals and soybean, after the Green Revolutions in Latin America in the 50s and in South Asia in the 60s, what is left? What we find today is that the answers that were given to the problems as they were understood in the 50s and 60s are not the answers that are adequate for today's question. And the food systems have succeeded in boosting yields, but failed on a number of other fronts. And let me identify perhaps 5 key areas in which the glass is still very much half empty. Firstly, hunger has not been significantly reduced. Those of you who are fond, as I am myself, of reading reports by UN agencies, you may have in mind the figure of 842 million people who are undernourished. This is a gross underestimate of the reality of the problem of hunger in the world. The reason why it's a very serious underestimation is because this is only a measurement of an estimated lack of calorie availability throughout the year, and it is based on a presumption that the poor need a certain number of calories that correspond to what people need for sedentary lifestyles. Now, we know that many poor people perform demanding physical labor. We also know that short-term food insecurity, short-term obstacles in having access to food may have very serious long-term consequences, particularly for the children's physical and mental development. And so, whilst this figure measures undernourishment in the most extreme sense of 1 year long lack of calorie availability if you have a sedentary lifestyle, it is significantly below the reality of the problem. The reality is we have today maybe 1.2 or 1.3 billion people who are still underfed. And that figure has not been significantly reduced over the years. Yes, the proportion of hungry people in the world has been declining, but we still have a very persistent problem of extreme poverty, of people unable to feed themselves because of an insufficient purchasing power. And the official figures about declining hunger are ones to be treated with great caution. Secondly, it is not enough to provide people with cheap calories. It's also important to pay greater attention to the quality of diets. And here the failure, I think everybody recognizes, has been massive. We have 2 billion people in the world who suffer from various types of micronutrient deficiencies, who lack zinc, iodine, iron, various vitamins or essential minerals. And as a result of this, we have people affected by diseases which could be prevented by more healthy, more adequate diets. In addition, we have a food system that has been providing the food processing industry with cheap inputs in the form of commodities that they have easy access to and that are very heavily subsidized in their production. But the food industry processes these inputs to provide most of the richest populations in the world with heavily processed foods that are heavy in salts, in fats, and in sugar, that result in a widespread development of non-communicable diseases linked to overweight, obesity, imbalanced diets. The figures are figures you are familiar with. 400 million people are obese in the world today. 1 billion other are overweight, and obesity is reducing life expectancy and is the source of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, various non-communicable diseases that are linked to inadequate diets combined with the shift to more sedentary lifestyles. That's a second failure. A failure to integrate nutrition concerns in the kind of food that is produced, because instead of encouraging people to produce food, we've encouraged them to produce commodities for large markets as convenient inputs for the agribusiness industry. Thirdly, the third failure is, of course, at the environmental level. In the 50s and 60s, that was not seen as a major concern. Yet, agro-industrial production has been the source of a huge dependency on fossil fuel for the production of food. It's been accelerating erosion and land degradation as a result of monocultures spreading all over. It's been a result of the pollution, it's been resulting in the pollution of water sources and of soils because of the huge, often excessive use of nitrogen-based fertilizers and pesticides on the field. The mechanization of production has, of course, allowed the food systems to be less intensive in labor and in a certain way more competitive, but they have had very problematic impacts by encouraging monocultures and creating this dependency on on fossil fuels for the future. A fourth impact of the systems as they've developed is on the use of resources, the efficiency with which we use resources. As Patrick Mulvaney very kindly reminded us, I produced a report on the fishing industry and the right to food, and how fishing had been developing, the new techniques that were being used, the subsidies that were going to subsidizing industrial fishing methods, and the competition between small-scale artisanal fishers on one hand and large industrial fish traders on the other hand. And in that report, I identified overfishing inter alia by the use of new fishing techniques as a very serious problem as fish stocks are being depleted, a problem that is, of course, magnified by climate change and the acidification of oceans. Now, I regret that there's one report I have not written, maybe in the future, and that is on industrial livestock. My final report, however, shall be quite comprehensive on that issue, very much in parallel to the issue of fishing. Industrial livestock production is unsustainable from the environmental point of view and is diverting scarce resources in terms of cereals produced to feeding livestock in ways that are completely inefficient. Just picture that by 2050, 50% of cereals produced in the world will go to feeding animals. In a report prepared in 2009, the FAO projected that whilst in 2005, 2007, we were producing some 200 million tons of meat per year, to match the growing demand for meat, we will need to produce 470 million tons, more than doubling the current levels of production. That, to me, is entirely unsustainable, and I believe that although there are ways to produce meat more efficiently, with a less important ecological footprint or hoofprint, as some have written, there's no other way than to reduce the consumption of meat. In our countries, in the EU, the average consumption of meat per person is about 95 kilograms per year per person. It's 120 in the US, in Australia, and New Zealand. It is 60 in China. We should move towards some 30, 33 kilograms per year per person as a global average for meat production to be sustainable, given the resources that we have. And it is an issue that in my final report I spent some time on. Fifth and finally, the food systems that have developed under this productivist paradigm of the 50s and 60s are food systems that have not been equitable from the point of view of their impacts on respective levels of incomes in rural areas and developing countries. In the north, of course, we know that they've led to the disappearance of many small farms and the depopulation of rural areas. In the south, the consequences have been even much more dramatic, because the farmers that have been displaced, the small farmers that could not be winning in the system rewarding the most competitive producers, these farmers have not been given any alternative because of a lack of qualifications and because of insufficient employment opportunities being created in the services and the industry sectors. These farmers have basically been confined to subsistence agriculture because of a lack of support to small-scale family farming. And it is still there in the rural areas in developing countries that extreme poverty is most widespread. The reason for this is very simple. We've been focusing on economies of scale, on efficiency, on global markets being provided with enough stuff for the food industry to respond to demand, and we've forgotten about the need for agriculture to also contribute to rural development and the reduction of rural poverty. The result is that many poor countries have been caught into a sort of vicious cycle as more and more impoverished farmers were forced to migrate to the cities. And this began in the 60s and was accelerated in the 1980s as the states retreated from agriculture under structural adjustment programs. The governments in these countries had no choice but to import more subsidized food from international markets, heavily subsidized by OECD taxpayers' money, and it was for them a very convenient solution to developed this addiction to cheap food dumped on international markets as a result of our policies in the north, not least the common agricultural policy in the EU. It was more difficult, it was more costly, it was less politically rewarding for them to support their small farmers, and so the cheap option was to increase this dependency on imports. The result, between 1990 and 2008, the average food bills of the least developed countries, the 48 poorest countries on earth, have been increasing by 400, 500%, multiplied by 5 or 6 over the past 18, 20 years. That is a very significant issue that leads these countries to be now extremely vulnerable to volatile prices on international markets, themselves the results of the price volatility of energy and of climate shocks that shall be repeating themselves in the future. In other terms, yes, we've succeeded in doing one thing, which is to increase the production of food per capita, but we failed on many other grounds. Yet, these are the areas which now should become the focus of our attention. And even though the Green Revolution might have avoided famines in the 60s, even though there were reasons to be concerned with low productivity in agriculture in the 50s and 60s, as indeed we were, the answers that were valid 60 years ago are not answers that are still valid for the 21st century. Today, we demand from food systems something else, not just to cope with increasing demand, as they must, as they do. We today produce the equivalent of 4,800 kilocalories of food per capita. Most of this gets either wasted or goes to feeding animals and is not used for human consumption, however. But the food systems must deliver something else. They must deliver, first of all, on the environment, on supporting and preserving the ecosystems on which we rely for the future. And the first priority that should be set for them today is to shift to sustainable production. I produced in 2010, I believe it was, a report on agroecology and the right to food. And it's a report that tries to show that resource efficiency, not just improve labor productivity, but resource efficiency should be a key priority in the future. Many people dismiss agroecology as a dream of the romantics, as a return to the past, as a nostalgia for the agriculture of the grandparents. No, it's agriculture for the future. I very much hope and I believe it shall be the kind of knowledge-intensive agriculture that our children will be performing, because they will have no choice, and much better to prepare this shift than to have to operate it under the pressure of crisis. Agroecology is a sustainable way of producing food by understanding how nature works, by understanding the interactions between trees, plants, and animals, by replicating at field level the natural complementarities that we see in the natural systems. And it is demanding because it requires training, it requires knowledge, it requires contextualized solutions, and it requires knowledge to be spread from farmer to farmer in horizontal ways rather than techniques being imposed top-down. But it is the future, and it is certainly for poor farmers in the global south who cannot afford to mortgage their land and to buy at high prices their inputs. It is certainly a more sustainable and less expensive way of practicing farming. A second demand that we have today for food systems is a demand for sustainable consumption. This has largely been a taboo. Yes, sustainable consumption was referred to in the Rio Declaration adopted in 1992. It was reiterated much more powerfully in Rio +20, the conference on sustainable development that took place in June 2012, but it still is largely unaddressed. And let me take 3 examples. First, overconsumption of meat in rich countries, which is only possible because we have the purchasing power in Europe, in the US, increasingly elsewhere, that allows these populations to use massive areas of land and water that exist in the global south to feed their increasing demand for meat. If we had a more equitable distribution of resources, we would not have the luxury demands of the richest compete against the basic needs of the poorest. Yet that is what is happening in a globalized food system in which people compete for land, water, as we see when we look at the huge impacts of soybean production, for example, on the Latin American continent to feed animals in the global north. A second illustration of this is, of course, the increased demand for liquid biofuels. That is a battle, unfortunately, that still is to be won, right? I was going to say is lost. No, not at all. It still is to be won. But it is a failure, because here we have politics that have trumped science and common sense that has been forgotten in the process. Agroenergy, I believe, is something that has much to deliver to reduce the dependency on fossil fuel in poor countries. But liquid biofuels for transport, when it feeds in ethanol and biodiesel the cars in the US and in the EU, is something extremely problematic because of the pressure on land it results in, because of the shift to export-led agriculture that it encourages, and because, again, it leads the luxury demands of the North to be pit against the basic needs of the South in the access to basic resource that they need. A third example, as regards sustainable consumption, is of course the need to address much more than we had in the past food waste and inefficiencies in the food systems. It is estimated that we waste some 1.3 billion tons of food every year, about half in the north and half in the global south for very different reasons. And to give you an idea of how much this represents, this is more than half the total production of cereals any year. We produce annually roughly 2.4 billion tons of cereals every year. So that's the amount of food that we lose. Now, for very different reasons, as I said, in developing countries and in rich countries. In rich countries, it's in the food processing industry, it's at household level, of course, that we waste lots of food. Some 120 kilograms per year per person in the EU, for example. In the south, it's of course at the field level primarily as a result of a lack of storage facilities, processing facilities, transport facilities to make sure that the crops, once they are collected, can be sold on markets and processed speedily enough not to be wasted. So we need much more investment to reduce losses, wastes in the food systems, because there's a huge leakage and we could do much more about this. Why have we not done much about this? Well, because it's probably not very promising as a market. It's probably not very interesting to many major economic actors to support that, although it would be a very economical way to addressing what some fear is a mismatch between supply and demand. So sustainable production, sustainable consumption, and finally the reduction of poverty. I think we have to take into account the fact that unless we support small farmers in the global south much better, poverty will continue in the rural areas in global south. The rural to urban migration will continue, and this vicious cycle I've been describing that is characteristic of the situation of many poor countries will continue to make obstacles to change. Now, here there was a real debate as to what is best for small farmers. And I believe that we should pursue in parallel two reform programs that support, that is what is common to them, the real choice of farmers. Let me explain. One reform program is to reshape the food systems so that they are more hospitable to small-scale farmers, allowing them, yes, access to seeds, allowing them to be better integrated in supply chains, allowing them to not to be cheated by the large actors from the agribusiness industry. And this issue of power relationships in the food systems is one completely forgotten in international summits about hunger, despite its key strategic importance. We must allow farmers wishing to join the mainstream food systems to do so in much better conditions than they have in the past. Mostly they've been excluded from these systems, which have not been shaped for them, but have been shaped for relatively larger producers. At the same time, many small farmers are not interested in joining these food systems. They want something else. They don't want better access to commercially bred seeds. They want to use their own land races. They want to have seed banks. They want to have seed fairs. They want to cultivate according to the local agroecological conditions of the zones in which they operate. They want not to join global supply chains. They're interested in selling on the local markets to feeding their families and communities, and we must allow that also. Real choice means neither of these two alternatives should be impossible for farmers to choose, and I believe freedom of choice should be our objective, which means not relegating farmers to low-income markets and relegating them to subsistence agriculture, but not obliging them either to join the mainstream food systems if they want to do something else. And I'm happy to have an exchange with you as to how these two reform programs can be made compatible with one another, as I believe they should and can. So the key problem is, of course, how to achieve this, because much of what I've said, many people agree. And certainly many scientists studying the food systems in a dispassionate fashion would share this diagnosis I proposed. But the key question is, which are the leverage points we can actionate to make change happen? And here let me propose that there's a difficulty in making the transition we need because of the interdependence of reforms in the global south and in rich countries. Why? In poor agricultural-based countries, particularly the least developed countries, we need to rebuild local food systems, reinvest in small-scale farming, reconnect small farmers to local markets, for the benefit not only of these farmers, but for the benefit also of the other sectors of the economy, and for the benefit of the urban populations who have a right to fresh, nutritious, locally produced food, instead of having to depend on the processed foods on the shelves of the supermarkets. However, that shift in developing countries is made very difficult because of the policies that we have here. I mean, not here in the French house, but here in the rich countries. We still have policies that reward bigness, that rewards economies of scale, that encourage farmers to produce not food but commodities, and in which there are many lock-ins in the system, making transitions extremely difficult to effectuate. And I see essentially 4 lock-ins. One is socio-technical. We have infrastructures, storage facilities, communication routes, technologies that reward the big agribusiness corporations and a food system that relies on heavily processed foods and long food chains. Socio-technical obstacles. We have socio-economic obstacles. We have very efficient large-scale producers who, of course, continuously grow, occupy dominant positions in food systems, and marginalize smaller-scale producers. So we have a socio-economic lock-in. We have, thirdly, a socio-cultural lock-in. Many families are now forgetting how to cook. Even if they were given access to fresh, cheap, affordable vegetables, they would not know what to do with them. They rely on the local grocery stores and the microwavable options that are proposed to them. So that is going to be very difficult to change. It's a third lock-in I see in our consumption practices, in reconnecting people to the locally produced, fresh, nutritious foods that they almost have forgotten they ultimately depend on. And fourthly, we have a social-political obstacle. The dominant players in the system who've been benefiting for many years now are so dominant that they occupy veto positions in the political system, making change extremely difficult to achieve, and resulting in a situation in which the food systems do not respond either to science or to what people demand, but respond to the most effective lobbyists in Brussels or in the City of London. Lock-ins are real. To overcome them, we need more democracy. And without democracy in the food systems, we will get nowhere. And I think one key contribution the right to food has to make is in allowing us to overcome these lock-ins in the system, allowing us to have food policies that are more transparent, better informed by what people not just demand, but the solutions they have to offer from their local experiments in rebuilding local food systems. This is why I put many hopes in food policy councils developing. I put many hopes in municipalities taking interest in farmers' markets developing, in school feeding programs developing, in local school canteens buying from local producers. I think much can be done at the local level to rebuild some sense of ownership of the food systems and ensuring that solutions can emerge from people understanding the local resources they can mobilize to rebuild local food systems that have largely been underdeveloped in the past 50, 60 years. But local food systems are not going to be able to thrive, to prosper, unless we have national level policies that are in place and that enable these local food systems to flourish and to emerge. And yes, I dedicated some of my work to working on these national food policies that we need. It's true for developing countries, of course. It's also true for countries such as Canada, that I could study in depth, or the US, where I spent quite some time over the past few years, who have no food policy, and where the food policy is actually an agricultural policy. Orwell had imagined in 1984 this Ministry of Plenty. Well, the USDA is a Ministry of Plenty. It must transform itself into a Ministry of Well-being. And thirdly, we need an enabling international environment. I think it's very difficult for countries to make a shift, to make the transition we need, unless the international environment is made more supportive of these efforts. That means, in particular, aligning trade policies, aligning investment policies, aligning food aid policies with the need to rebuild local food systems, to support social movements that invent local solutions that can be scaled out from place to place and be replicated across different contexts. We need to ensure that the various policies that shape the international environment converge towards the realization of the right to food. The place where this can happen is the Committee on World Food Security, on which someone like Nora McKeown has invested so much energy, because that is where democracy can be achieved in reshaping the global food security agenda. But there is today a very strong competition to define which forum shall be taking the lead in shaping the food agenda for the 21st century. So this is what I hope my successor will be able to pursue. Thank you.
That is absolutely wonderful. This morning, when you spoke to members of the House of Lords and MPs at breakfast, Jeremy Lefroy, who's on the International Development Committee, MP for Stafford, said it was the best summary of the food system he has ever heard. And I think you topped it. Thank you very much indeed. It was absolutely excellent and so rich. And I think we will be waiting with bated breath for your written report, which will be presented, I think, in the middle of March to the UN Human Rights Council. We will look forward to that, particularly to mark the hoofprints of what of the livestock system, which you promise will be there. But thank you so much. There is such richness there. We'll have a chance to ask a few questions in a moment.